Grace to you and peace from thine who is, who was, and who's to come. I am George Anthony Pratt, a second-year history and religion double major from Jacksonville, Florida, and it is my pleasure to serve as the Scholarship and Practical Ministry Chair for this academic school year. On behalf of our founding dean, the Reverend Dr. Lawrence Edward Carter Sr., Associate Campus Minister, the Reverend Quincy James Reinhardt, and President Mr. Gabriel Gennard Cloud, we welcome you to this preaching lab and Thurman Thursday. Today's Afro-hermeneutic is from writer and abolitionist David Walker in his appeal. He says, "It is a notorious fact that the major part of the white Americans have, ever since we have been among them, tried to keep us ignorant and make us believe that God made us and our children to be slaves to them and theirs. Oh my God, have mercy on white Christian Americans." Ashe. This evening, we are so privileged to have joining with us a chapel favorite. She is the Bandy Professor of Preaching at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She is also the historiographer and executive director of the Department of Research and Scholarship for the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It is my honor to welcome back to the chapel one of the world's greatest preachers, the Reverend Dr. Teresa Fry Brown.
Good evening, Mr. Pratt. I don't know if I'll live up to your introduction, but I'll do my best. But I thank you, and it's so wonderful to be back. It's been a while since I've been with you, and even in this particular venue, I hope we have something that we can share and talk about.
Certainly, it's always great to see you, Dr. Fry Brown.
Thank you. And so, today I was asked to talk about prophetic preaching and what that means. And so I'm going to do some basic kind of information about what it takes to be a prophetic preacher in an era of fatigue and fragmentation. So we're going to start our PowerPoint, I hope, and kind of talk through what it means to do prophetic truth-telling in a season of fatigue and fragmentation. And so as we go to our slides a little bit at a time, you will see that we'll start talking about what kind of season we're in right now. Then I want to talk a bit about some ways that we can improve our prophetic truth-telling or preaching, or however you want to talk about proclamation. And also then talk about some areas of content that we need to be using if we're going to be talking about prophetic preaching. So if we can advance this slide, it's fine. So we begin with this idea from the Didache from centuries ago about speaking what the Spirit tells you, and how the test is how you've interpreted what the Spirit tells you. But that caveat that not everyone who speaks in the Spirit is a prophet. Only the one that walks in the way of the Lord is very food for thought, I think. Because I often tell people, as we go to the next one, I often tell people that when people are running around calling themselves prophets, they have to understand that there's a responsibility with prophetic speech. And in the biblical text, I believe that all of the prophets died. And so when people volunteer to be prophets and name themselves prophets and have suits that say they're prophets and demand certain kinds of money to be a prophet, they are really treading on some very tenuous ground, because it says that you can say you're a prophet, but unless you're walking in the way of the Lord, you are in danger. So these times that we are in, there are all these traumatic life disruptions that are going on. And some of us are suffering from compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, because there are people with whom we're associated that may be sick or have lost their jobs or can't seem to get through the class. Some of us are in church hurt. And so we approach this task with some post-traumatic stress syndrome just for being members of the church, because someone doesn't like how you sound, or someone doesn't like how you dress, or who you love, or any of those kinds of things. We are also in a season of clone syndrome, where too many people are trying to be somebody else. And if they see somebody that gets a certain number of hits on their particular sermon, or a number of amens or whatever, they think they have to do the same thing. So we have a lot of mini-me's running around. We really don't need the mini me's at all, but that's in fact what we have. And then there's this social political pressure that I know I don't have to explain to you, the political pressure, not just having to do with the presidential election, but all kinds of political things. I always tell people when I enter the room, it's a political statement because I'm a Black woman of a certain age and a certain hair texture who shows up. That's a political statement. So I'm not just talking about presidential elections or voting down the ticket, but things that also we entered into just by being part of society. Many of us in this era cannot speak because we have a fear of success and failure and fear of others and ourselves, unmanageable stress. And some of us are just tired right now. Prophets get tired. People who preach get tired. They get worn out. And because people have moved from in-person preaching to on the screen, it triples or sometimes quadruples the amount of stress we have trying to meet people because they're not right in front of us. So we move on. So we move on to our next kind of piece, trying to think through on this next slide, trying to think through Thurman Thursdays, when he talks about not being silent. There's no limit to the power that can be released through us. But my favorite, of course, has been attributed to him is don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive and go do that. One of the things that I know that if one is going to preach, one has to like preaching. One also has to like people. And if you don't like people, you shouldn't be preaching. And some people, you can tell by what they say that they hate people and they don't really like themselves. You can't be prophetic because you have to be pastoral and have some kind of engagement with the people before you can be prophetic. So we move on. So prophet, to speak forth, speaking in the name of God, someone that's designated as an accepted spokesperson of God, and someone that addresses the community on the behalf of the holy and the sacred. Yes, there's some ecstatic kind of possession, but you're addressing the community with what God has put in you, not what you came up with, which is why we have to be very careful about calling ourselves prophets, because we're supposed to speak what God has given us and not our own agenda. Next slide, please. It means that we speak out against evil in others, but also our own complicity in what's going on. And I think too often when people get up and they talk about prophetic truth telling, they're ready to, I call them keyboard cowards. They're ready to critique everybody else, but they never look at themselves. They never say, what is it that I did not do? How did I speak evil of someone? And now I'm here using cancel culture on someone that's done something that I've done, but nobody knew that I did it. All right. And we're speaking to persuade people to accept God's power to implement change. So I often talk about the difference between empowerment and empowerment. Empowerment comes from what God has placed in us. Empowerment is what we push down on people. So if you're preaching, telling people, do this, do this, do this, do this, that's not about empowerment. That's about you pushing your will off on them. Unless you are speaking what God has told you to do. What we're trying to do is persuade the people to accept God's power in them to implement change in their lives and in others. Next slide, please. And when we talk about this transformation, we have to understand that often people are preaching and they think they're doing a prophetic sermon and they're saying, do this, do this, do this, do this. And they don't give anybody a time to think about what it is they're being asked. So you hear people demeaning people and telling people, if you don't preach this on Sunday morning, then you're not a preacher. The devil is a lie. You're pastoral, your context. There are other ways to talk about an issue. There are ways for you to, in the music or in the prayer or in a litany, to talk about a particular justice issue and then preach what your people need to get them strong enough to go out and then do something about things in the world. There's the attributive justice, that means each one is given according to their needs. There's the distributive justice, where it's the rules of fair play that we find in the Old Testament, where we protect the poor. There's a retributive justice, and some of us are really good at this. We try to make right-wrong relationships, but some of us harm people while we're trying to say, let's make this right for everyone. Injustice is the violation of God's promise for all persons being created equal. And so we move on from that, and we have to, we think in terms of what forgiveness is. And sometimes people rush to talking about let's do a kumbaya moment, reconciliation, but there's been no discussion about forgiveness. Forgiveness hasn't been given. Forgiveness has not been received. But we want to say we did it, and that's why we keep cycling through the same junk over and over and over again. So Samuel DeWitt Proctor tells us that we have to believe that change is possible. That we have to believe that sometimes even the smallest act is the linchpin that starts us towards some kind of justice stance, that starts us towards some kind of faith stance where we can speak what we need to do, that we become these watch persons. And the biblical text says that you're given this word to say, if you warn the people, that's good. If you warn the people, they don't do anything about it, you've done your job. But if you don't warn the people and the people die, that's on the person that says they're a prophetic preacher. That's on the one that says they're the prophet. So we move on just a little bit. So keep that in mind, that we're sentinels. We're sentinels. So we go to the next slide, please. Zora Neale Hurston, that Harlem Renaissance author and one of my favorites, talks about there are years that ask questions and years that give answers. And I think sometimes what holds us back of having prophetic voice is because we want to have answers all the time. And maybe this is the time where we're raising questions and not tying everything up in a nice little answer all the time. This is where sermons fail, when a preacher thinks that he or she has the answer to everything in life, where maybe what we need to do is sit and think about what's going on. Maybe what we need to do is try to figure out the puzzle together. And that's what part of preaching is about. Preaching is not to give you a quick fix, but preaching is to raise consciousness so we can make some choices for ourselves. Our next slide. Transformatively, I want you to just kind of think, I don't know if you can use the chat, but I want you to drop in. I'm just going to use one word right now. I'm going to use one word. I want you to think about the sensory perception that's needed for us to be connected with other people. In the Old Testament, worship is multi-sensory. But these are some words that pop up when we start talking about prophetic preaching. And I want you in the chat to drop, what does hatred look like? These are just one word answers right now. So whoever's doing that, you can put something in the chat. Think about what death tastes like, or what life looks like or smells like, or how does discrimination move? Okay. And once these kinds of words that come up are put into our senses, then we can start dealing with them more, because just like we have to step into a text and wrestle with the text in order for it to come alive, we also have these trigger words that we have to think about how people feel, how they perceive when you start talking about hatred or love or discrimination or life or death or bigotry or supremacy. Those things get in people's senses. And when we are preaching these kind of heavy topics I'll talk about in a little bit, we have to understand that sometimes people reject it because it's so overwhelming when you start talking about these things. It doesn't mean they don't want to hear it. It doesn't mean they don't want to do some kind of action. It means that their sensory input has saturated them in such a way that they feel immobile, absolutely immobile. Let's go to the next one, please. One of the things that I tell people when we're going to talk about how we set up a sermon that is prophetic, or how we start talking about things that are prophetic, you first have to be aware that there's some kind of issue. Just an awareness. I often hear people say, I didn't know that was going to happen. And that means that we have to open ourselves to all kinds of input, just not the news that you usually watch somebody else's station. It means that we read widely, that we read deeply, that we do a close read on what's going on in the world, that we find out that something is out of kilter. And then we start analyzing it. And you pull in all kinds of points of view. Instead of just preaching your point of view, study everybody's point of view, because the truth of the matter is, when we are preaching, everybody doesn't agree with us, and everyone has not had our experience. So we have to bring in, Jesus would say, you have heard it said this way, and now I give you this. And so sometimes we have to say, this group believes this group believes this is what I believe, and then let them make up their mind which one they believe. Allow a space for grief. When we start talking about issues in this world, there's grief. There's this where is God kind of question. Who is God? Why is God working this out this way? Grief in the preacher and grief in the listener. Then we start developing some appropriate ways to address whatever the issue is, whether it is, I'm now going to give you a litany of things that I've heard have worked, or give somebody something manageable. That's the action. Too many times when we preach what we think are social justice or prophetic sermons, we give people, go out and change the whole world instead of giving them something they can do right now, today. That's where we run into problems. We want just go out and do it. And then when nothing does, because people are again paralyzed by what looks like this insurmountable thing, but give them something small to do. Think about how we pass each other, even now on social media, when you have all these little boxes and everything around. And I try to read people's faces when I'm teaching class. Something as simple as, how do you have eye contact or not with someone? Your facial expressions. It's called attentiveness that we need in preaching. When I said you have to be pastoral, it is about how do we see somebody else's humanity and begin to understand not everyone in our congregation, not everyone in our school is able to do the same kind of action. When I was much younger in college, I was the one that had to do the typing, and I was the one that wrote the speeches, and I was the one that raised money for bail and things like that, because that's what I was good at. I wasn't good at being out on the street. And I was the one that had to contact parents when somebody was arrested. Everybody has something to do, but too often in our sermons, we want everybody to do the same thing, instead of understanding you have to give people action that they can accomplish to feel a part of the bigger scheme of things. We will go on to the next one, please. If we're going to start talking about this prophetic preaching, this transformative preaching, read, facts check, fact check, fact check, fact check. Too many times I've heard preachers that have heard the first report and start going on the first report, and they don't know, they haven't reevaluated the situation. So they're preaching one thing, but the truth comes up later. So fact check, do your own research, admit your complicity. When in my Transformative Voices class, and I'll get to this list in a little bit, I start talking to people about, say, capital punishment. I'm still working my stuff out with capital punishment. And so I have to be honest about that. So it's like, if you know you're working through something, be honest and say, we're working through this. Believe that you can change, believe others can change. Use your own voice. Name yourself. Do not pretend to be someone you are not when you're preaching. And look at the values that are there. And this last piece about prophetic engagement, some of us think prophetic preaching means that God is deaf. So we scream through a sermon instead of talking with people. We just think the louder it is, the more prophetic we are. That is not the case. Let us go on. Philip Wogelman says that we have to preach. We have to understand that we're preaching with real people that have real issues, and not everybody has the same issue. Even when we talk about issues of race, people have different kinds of engagement with race. We talk about gender, we talk about sexuality. These are real people with real concerns and real things happening in their lives, and sometimes we act as if they don't exist. That there's legitimacy in what they're talking about, that we have to do our homework, but we have to do manageable stuff and balance in what we're doing. I also must say, before we go to the next slide, that one cannot preach prophetically every Sunday and live, because it takes a lot of emotion, it takes a lot of thought, it takes a lot of energy to do that. And sometimes we walk around in sackcloth and ashes forever and never find any sense of joy. If you talk with people or read people's works that were active in civil rights, the modern civil rights movement, and even contemporarily, people are burning out because they forget that you have to step back and rejoice that you're still alive. You have to step back and give some people just time before we go on and do something else. Yes, I understand about the pandemics in society. Yes, I understand about injustice. And I understand that we will soon shrivel on the vine if that's all we can talk about day in and day out. That sometimes you got to have a praise. Sometimes you have to just talk about how good God is. I know people are acting crazy. I'm still here. I still have my mind. I'm still able to do some things. Next one, please. We have to preaching. Some people, when they think they're prophetic, there's never any hope. We understand there were prophets in the biblical text that didn't live to see the fruition of what they were doing, but they live with a sense of God's, as they put it, the already and the not yet, the Godness, that God is everywhere and God is still working even when we can't see God, that we have to have textual integrity, which means that if you tell someone you're going to use the text and stop lying about it. This is the text that's been selected. This is the text that I'm going to use. And don't make up text. Dolores Williams used to talk about the difference between scripture and scription. Too many of us are preaching scription, which means we've taken a biblical text and twisted all the original language and meaning out of it, and we've made up our own gospel according to Teresa, right? And where's the affirmation of God and humanity in what you're doing? And consider your context. Context. When I said you have to be pastoral, know if what you are talking about is something that is important where you are, or if this is a Sunday you're going to enlighten, but also understand we do not change things on a Sunday morning 20-minute sermon. We change things by surrounding that sermon with Bible study, surrounding that sermon with discussion, some way to talk about the topic. So by the time we get to the sermon, people understand what the topic is, they understand the statistics, and then they can join in like, yes, this is something with which we must be concerned. What can we do about it? And then the delivery becomes very important. People read your embodiment and can tell if you're just up there trying to perform or if you in fact have some interest in what's going on. I'm going back to, if people understand that you want them to be saved, if you want us all to live, they will accept your delivery even if you have to whisper it. Next slide. Let's go to the next slide. This is fine. All right. So what I wanted to do before we go to questions is talk just a bit about what prophetic preaching sometimes, particularly in our context, we narrow it down to race, sexuality, sometimes gender, but it's much bigger than that. Christine Smith talks about the interlocking spheres of issues, that if you talk about one, it also impacts the other. So I'm going to just real briefly roll through about 10, 15 of these for you to consider, that when you're going to do prophetic preaching, think about where your context is and what kinds of issues impact. Yes, there's gender and race and other things, and all of these are embedded in those kinds of things, and ethnicity. Gentrification and redlining. You've heard me say, some of you have heard me say before, if you look at what happened when the children of Israel were entering into Canaan, somebody already lived there. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. That's gentrification. Right? They went in and took over somebody's property. Gentrification has all those elements we always talk about. Affluenza and conspicuous consumption. I have more than 2 pairs of shoes now since I grew up. I have more shoes than I know what to do with. That's affluenza. Conspicuous consumption is so I have to admit, I have a complicity there with conspicuous consumption. Could I get back with minimal things? Yes. Have I done it? No. So I would be a horrible preacher. I stood up and said, and all you people have all this wealth and you're so horrible, when I understand that I have more than I need. I have more than one computer when there are people that don't have one at all, right? Sex trafficking and prostitution and the rape culture are all in the biblical text. And I don't understand sometimes why we dance around those as if it is just a social issue when it's in the biblical text. Educational disparity, school promotion, buildings, where schools are, what kind of funding they get. That's an issue that's also about prophetic. Body consciousness and beauty standards, homelessness or housing deficit. Because when you talk to persons, some people who are living out on the street, not in the homes that we talk about, but they call their boxes their home. They call their tents their homes. So maybe we have to have a different kind of language. The other thing is, when we start investigating these things, is not tell people what they need, ask them what they need. Next one, please. Verbal linguistic othering. Linguistic othering is my language for the way that we talk about people, the way that we categorize people all the time, saying that we are justice seekers, the way that we critique people's bodies, the way that we critique their skin tone, the way we critique what school they went to or what sorority or fraternity they're in, or how tall they are, or how broad they are, or something, ways that we diminish someone else. I think James says something about power of the tongue. How are we doing that? How are we diminishing others with our mouths? Bullying, we know, elder abuse and child abuse, sexual harassment, immigration reform and restrictions. That's in the biblical text. Just war theory and human rights. Just war theory. How can we talk about war when there are places in the biblical text where God says, go in and take all of that out. Just go destroy people. And then say we're anti-war. We have to interrogate the text to see what that means and interrogate our position in society when we start talking about that. Are we talking about human rights just for people that look like us? Do we turn our faces away from people in cages at the border, or women that are given abortions or being sterilized at the border? That's human rights, global human rights, which means that we also have to think past our own block. Too many of us are too parochial to be prophetic preachers because we only think about ourselves, our family, our city, our church, our school, instead of understanding humanity's rights. Sentencing guidelines and drug policies, I'm sure some of you have addressed that. Let us go. Medical testing and access. It keeps coming up over and over and over again, not only about the vaccine, but all across history. Surrogacy and cloning. Those are some issues that we need to be thinking about. Mental health treatment. People have preached about the Gerasene demoniac, but do they think about what mental health is? And when is it hidden? And when can we see it? And what does Jesus say about mind? If we're talking about loving God without our heart, soul, and mind, what is it that's important about mind? We'll talk about physicality all the time, but what about what leads to mental health crises? Euthanasia and end-of-life treatment is something that sometimes in particularly Black churches, we don't talk about. The end of life and people's choices of not receiving treatment. Or what does it mean for someone to commit suicide? And we misappropriate suicide. Judas committed suicide, right? But we pick up a Catholic teaching about suicide meaning you're going to hell. That is not what the biblical text says. So you have to look at what end of life and euthanasia is all about. Racial profiling, we have voter rights, we have technological apartheid. I spoke a little bit about that. That's also some fodder, some content for a prophetic sermon. Let's go. When we are preaching, when we've decided what form we're using, and please, 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 I pray that none of you are preachers that get caught up in 3-point sermons. That's what the Puritans did because they believed that it was Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And it was the 3 strands of a cord that could not be broken. So some of us get so caught up in structuring 3-point sermons that we don't have a balance in the sermon, or we love alliteration, so we have to find that third A. If you have 1 point, preach that 1 point. Preach that 1 point, preach that 1 point, and don't worry about having all this wonderful language on top of it. But content-wise, what is the long-term effect of what I say when I preach? Can I live with what I've just said? Can I stand up to the fallout of saying we have to affirm everyone and then watch people come for us? Do I need to say anything about an issue at all directly? Or, as I said before, can that be addressed in prayer? Can it be addressed in music? Can it be addressed in a ritual or something? What does the Bible say about preachers who are under fire for saying what God has told them to say? And so then a question becomes, as we go to the next slide, do I want to be popular, or do I want to do what God says for me to do? Do I know that if I go and stand, and sometimes we blame the Spirit for too much, when I go and stand, as Proctor was saying, in the prophet's shoes, I say this, and people are throwing things at me or tweeting things about me or demeaning my character, but I know in my spirit that that is what God said for me to do. Can I stand on it? Can I remember backward about the hope that God gives, even when people don't want to hear it? I think that was that whole crucifixion thing, right? So So can I do that as a preacher, or am I going to preach easy sermons so that everybody loves me all the time? All right. The next one, please. This is the last one, and then we're going to go to questions, I think, where we talk about Cecil Williams, who started Glide Memorial Church, went and rescued the church actually some years ago in San Francisco. This true church that stands on the edge where the real moans and groans are. Because sometimes I always find it very interesting that people said, well, we can't get to church and now we can't have church. Well, what was church for you in the first place? But sometimes people move past what needs to be addressed for the comfortability in the building, for the doctrine that protects them from anything, any engagement with life. What would have happened to us if Jesus just stayed in the carpenter shop? What would have happened to us if we didn't have models of Jesus moving out to where the people were in need and addressing the needs there? But some of us call ourselves prophets and we know nothing about anyone around us. And so not only do we read widely, but engage more than just what's right in front of us. That's what you need to do if you have prophetic voice. That's what you need to do if you're going to be a transformative voice in these fragmented and fragile times. Last thing before we go to questions. Please make sure that when you are preaching in this particular time, that you're not holding people hostage for 45, 50 minutes because people are oversaturated. A good 25, no longer than 30-minute sermon should hold them. And if you don't catch people in the first 8 minutes, you lose them altogether. And they will go ahead and start going to some other kind of site. And I know that we have enough technological information to understand that you can tell when people jump in and jump off, but they're going to be jumping in and jumping off unless you get to the point and tell them exactly what the text is saying and what we need to be doing quickly and firmly and concisely, and not wander all over the place just because you like to see yourself on a screen. Thank you very much. Mr. Pratt.
Thank you, Dr. Fry Brown. You mentioned Wagaman, and when you mentioned him, I thought about one of his famous quotes. We cannot preach about love unlovingly. It is a self-contradiction. And in thinking about that quote, and also you mentioned Thurman, in one of his famous quotes, the religion of Jesus says to the disinherited to love you. The religion of Jesus says to the disinherited to love your enemies. And in thinking about preaching prophetically, considering the time that we are now in, especially with the presidential election, how does one preach reconciliation?
I think that one doesn't preach reconciliation until they go through those steps I was talking about. We can't assume that everybody's on the same page. We have to analyze what the situation is, and someone has to ask for forgiveness. You can't tell them to forgive you. They have to want to be forgiven. Someone has to ask for forgiveness, and then you have to give them the forgiveness. That reconciliation means to bring pieces together. So the steps are the steps of reconciliation, are the forgiveness piece. Then there has to be repentance. Sometimes we rush and just say, "Oh, I'm sorry," just so they can get to the next point. But there has to be some repentance. That means turning away from what we've done, not turning all the way around and going back to it, which is what happens cyclically in political kinds of things. People love you until they get your vote, then they don't care about what you're doing. So that's not reconciliation. That's prostitution. And so there has to be some healing and some honesty about what's going on. There has to be some sincerity about this is so fragmented that I can see no wholeness anywhere. Okay. And people think that reconciliation is just, I'm sorry, we hold hands, we sing. No, it is work. It is work. It's deep work. Because when I said we have to even look at our own complicity, it means that we have to, it's that moment where the kairos moment, where we're emptying ourselves of stuff that is built up. I mean, we have literature now talking about how generational trauma goes. That's a lot of stuff to carry. So there's some deep work that has to be done. There has to be some cleaning up inside and out for people to even start coming together. And then you have to be committed to whatever we have decided together needs to be done, and not just one-sided, but both parties have to be committed to saying, let's work together to change this. It doesn't mean that I'm Black, so I have to bear the burden of now doing all the work to make everybody else happy. It means that we're both going to share the load. So in preaching, we have to make sure it's not you go do it, but we go do it. So the language of preaching is always plural. It's not singular.
Understood. And in thinking about doing the work and ridding ourselves of some things, when you talked about census perception and certain trigger words, you mentioned that within a congregation, we have to consider that not everyone is able to do the same action. And so, as preachers in a 21st century context, how do we become more inclusive of differently abled people within our congregations and rid ourselves of ableism?
I think that one has to be aware that there are visible disabilities and invisible ones. I think that some of it comes from our fear of our own bodies because we've been in this period of this body consciousness, and I think that it's old book Kathy Black talks about even the language that we use to describe people, right? In the biblical text, it says, "Hear, O Israel." What about people that don't hear? I will lift up mine eyes to the hills. What about people that have, I mean, I've had cataracts and I have lenses in, right? But what about people that don't have the vision or cannot lift up? And even our language becomes oppressive. And if the language is oppressive, we don't get to the action, right? We have this idea, I have a couple of people that I know are working on disabilities and preaching, that if you're representing God, you have to have this Europeanized perfect body, that you don't get older, that you don't get sick, that you don't have a broken arm, that you don't have cerebral palsy, that you don't have a lisp, all of these kinds of things, because that's been built into this standard of beauty that we have bought it into the church without realizing that we're dehumanizing people, or we try to make persons with disabilities the exception to the rule instead of understanding they are persons like everyone else. And then we start doing these overly compensating when we're talking. Oh, you're such God's little angel. That's not that to me, it doesn't make sense. So we have to be aware of what body images are preferred. I mean, we do this with people that don't have visible disabilities. You and I had a chat about hair. There are people that think you wear hair a certain way, you can't be a preacher. There are people that think that if you have glasses, you can't be a preacher, all those kinds of things. So we bring these very mundane kinds of beauty standards and body standards into a sermon and a pulpit. So then we have to ask ourselves, did God make mistakes? So how can we talk about a God who loves us and put us together in the way that God wanted us to put together and then say, except for you? You're not being prophetic. You're not being inclusive, but you're doing exceptionality. Yeah. Language.
And also, in thinking about prophetic preaching beyond talking about race or sexuality, how does a preacher move toward the more unfamiliar or even the more uncomfortable texts in thinking about Dinah or Deuteronomy 20 and 21, those certain narratives in the Hebrew Bible that are not often preached from the pulpit? How does one responsibly preach those type of sermons?
I think that we have, if you'll forgive the term, ghettoized certain parts of the Bible. I think that we forget that the entirety of what we in our particular denominations have determined our canon, that we don't proof text and just pull out what we think is easy, or pull out the text that gets everybody to shout and run around and slobber all over the sanctuary. There are texts that are there, and every text is there for a reason, so we should do all of those. Our own particular isms are what prevent us from preaching something about Dinah or Tamar or the woman that's chopped up in 17 pieces and taken every way. That's our own prejudices. And I think that we also understand that there are people that preach these texts, but we don't hear them, right? Because some of us only listen to people on big platforms. So number one, we have to see how many people are actually preaching those texts. Because I have people that preach those texts in little groups that I teach. And there are some people that will never have a big name that are preaching these texts because they value the entirety of what the biblical text is. Sometimes when people are strict lectionary preachers, they leave out some very hard texts. Phyllis Tribble has a book from the 1980s called Texts of Terror. And it goes to this list of texts that people seem to avoid. And part of this is my own hermeneutic. Some of the texts we avoid is because of our own position of not having worked out how we feel about what's going on in the text. I'm back at complicity again. Okay. And so some of those things we haven't worked out ourselves, so we don't want to engage it. And you don't get a real big hoop when you say, don't rape. You don't get a good honorarium when you talk about why were these people sacrificed? You know, unless the person who's invited you has a sensibility about justice for everyone. And you have, again, surrounded those kind of difficult texts with other kinds of teaching and discussion and talking. And the people know you just didn't show up to get a little rise out of them. Okay.
In thinking about preaching from one's own hermeneutic, whether it may be womanist or queer, it requires being critical of the text. And I guess out of that, a question arises: how does a preacher articulate responsibly their opposing view of the text and also dominant culture in a sermon in a manner that is both fair and accurate, while also being aware that all congregates may not be on the same level of thinking or education?
Okay. All right. There is, in biblical studies, there's something called reception history. That means that people interpret the text from their particular social location. So when I go to a text, I don't care who, I mean, I've written commentaries, all these other kinds of things. But when I go to a text, I have no choice but to view the text through my own eyes. I don't have to apologize for that. I'm a 69-year-old Black woman. I cannot interpret the text like a 17-year-old white man. And so these texts that are there, yes, there have been these people that have done interpretation of the biblical text. And so now that we have a label and we label ourselves womanist, then people think that it's less than the other person. I had a discussion in one of my classes last week. We were using an African-American male's interpretation of a text, and someone said, well, we can't use that because that's by a Black man. And I said, but I use things that are interpreted by white men. It depends on what I'm looking at. So I don't think you apologize for whatever your social location is and your hermeneutic. You have to have your own hermeneutic. Now, you can be in conversation with someone else's, but I don't think you have to apologize for it, because you can only see what you see and what you've experienced. And you are denying yourself and your engagement with what God's word is if you say, okay, well, you know, I'm an older woman, and so maybe I shouldn't see it that way because then people are going to be upset. Well, then I'm lying to you. That makes me inauthentic if I don't approach it as in my queerness or my age. If I don't approach it that way, I'm being inauthentic with the text. And if God wanted us all to preach the same way, God could have always made us this very same way. That's my hermeneutic, since you asked me about hermeneutics, right? And so I think that we get too bogged down, and we just did this huge search for biblical scholars last year. And so I learned a whole lot about this. And so, yes, there's the traditional historical criticism, which is usually by European Americans. And then when other people come and look at it, then it's almost as if you have to make an excuse for seeing things through your own eyes. I think that that's unfortunate. Same thing with history. Think about all the people that read one kind of history growing up, and then you bring in African-American history on top of it. So why should you apologize for seeing things through your own eyes without bringing your perception into the text? Because you're speaking for a particular context. So why would I give you European theology in an African-American setting?
Certainly. And Alumnus Kyle Stevenson asked a question that was going to be very similar to my next question. In talking about prophetic preaching, it assumes hope and that it causes one to try to change something. Well, what do you say to the nihilist? And Reverend Stevenson asks, if prophetic preaching offers a new vision for the world, does Afro-pessimism fit in with the gospel since it seems to be getting a lot of discussion in the last few years?
I think it has a label in the last few years. I think that the reason that I have a different interpretation about let my people go than other people, but still understanding it's going to take centuries from it, doesn't mean that I don't see hope in the text. I think that we have, I mean, it's like Black women were doing things years before I knew that 35 years ago when we started saying womanism, but that doesn't mean it's brand new. I think it's a way to engage it. And now it's called Afro-pessimism. I'm real clear about that. And some say nihilist. But I grew up listening to preachers that said, okay, this is what it says in the book, but look what's happening in society. That's not going to work for us. Then you have to make up your own mind. Remember, I'm saying it as a prophetic preacher, you don't tell people this is the end. We don't wrap everything up in a big bow and say this is the end. We're supposed to lead people give people information to start thinking about the world. And somebody's circumstances I'm preaching to do not have the same benefits that I have. So someone may say that they're a nihilist. I mean, I personally, living in this, I mean, I preach hope all the time, but there's some days I get up and say, I don't want to be bothered with one more Christian telling me it's going to be all right. So maybe that day I'm part of Afro-pessimism. I don't know. Okay. Someone asked something about starting ministry. I forget what that question was.
Yes, our associate campus minister, Reverend Reinhardt, he asked, for those persons who are just starting their preaching ministry, can you talk to us about how one should preach prophetically when there's a difference in denominational doctrine?
I think that one of the things I had to learn to do before I got to the point that I was is to learn. I was raised in the Baptist church with grandparents that said, don't lie to the people. There's a consequence for truth telling. There's also a consequence for not doing what God has told you to do. So we have to understand, are we talking about someone that controls all of our lives and says you're not going to be ordained if you speak the truth? Well, do you need to be with that group of people? Right? The other piece is learn language well enough. My mother taught me that if you learn language well enough, you can cuss somebody out and they don't know you did it until you get home. That was my mom. Learn language where you can talk about what you want to talk about without using the trigger words. Finesse it as you're starting out. Because if you use there's a way to talk about Black Lives Matter without saying Black Lives Matter, because you know some people in your own Black congregation don't want to hear that because they're upset because lesbian women started it. Right? So they reappropriate it to make it easier to deal with. Well, you use language to say just what you want to say without saying y'all just don't want this to happen. So you, as you're starting out, be familiar with language, read the context. What we often find is the leadership in a denomination may think one thing, but the people in the pews may think something else. So maybe you can't preach it because if you're just starting out, you're not preaching every Sunday anyway. That's where I did things in Bible study. I did things in small groups so we could talk about things that you don't talk about on Sunday morning until you get to a certain status. So I don't think you have to give up on the denomination. Sometimes you do, but I think that there's a way for you to discuss things. I mean, you find ways to discuss things with your friends or in classes in order to get your voice out and keep it moving. You have to do the same thing in church because not everybody wants to be free. The reason Jesus kept saying, do you want to be made whole? The truth of the matter is some people in churches and denominations don't want to be made whole. They want it to be easy. So you have a choice to stay and fight or leave it. If you're going to stay and fight, find out how much it's going to cost you. And are you willing to bear the cost of it? If you're not willing to bear the cost of it, keep your mouth shut. That's all I can say about that. Right.
Also, in the presentation, you talk about the preacher themselves being fatigued. quite practically, how does one move past that, or how does one grapple with that? The fact that a pastor has to get up in front of a congregation every Sunday and render this word when he, she, or they is tired themselves. What does self-care look like for the preacher or the prophet?
About 2012, I started writing about justice fatigue. And part of justice fatigue means that you see, we're back at nihilism again, right? That you keep doing the work, you keep saying what's going on. It doesn't seem like anything's changed. That's part of Kyle's, Reverend Kyle, one of my former students, Afro-pessimism question, right? It just seems like you're just worn out. That's, when I started the disruptive stuff, that's normal stuff. I don't know where we got the idea that preachers are out of, like little robots that just keep going and they got a sound word and a great hoop every Sunday. And so there are ways to value who you are enough and understand who you are enough to do collaboration, right? You don't have to do 75 minutes every Sunday. Some Sundays you can do 5 minutes if it's a sound word and set your behind down. There's also, you have to know yourself enough to know when it's okay to let somebody else come in and preach that Sunday. That's not a guest and not a high holy day in the church, but just say, I need this, because preachers are burning out, particularly in the pandemic. I keep talking to people about, you don't have to do all the bells and whistles that everybody else is doing. What is success for you? Redefine success for you. And to think through what it looks like when I'm just so tired of talking about race. That's why I gave you all those other things to talk about. I'm so tired of talking about race and about the president and all this other kind of stuff, and I just can't make it. I just can't go, and people are dying. It's okay to say, let me step back for 1 week. Let me talk about something else for 1 week. Let us just set, as Luke Power would say, let's lament this week. We don't have to do happy, happy, joy, joy, 17 laps around the sanctuary. This week, maybe we just have to say, God, it is too much to do, and lament, and lament, and lament, and lament, and ask God to fill in the blanks for you, because you're human. You are not a super person. And that's part of the problem in churches right now, before the pandemic, is preachers got in their heads that they could do all things, and they forgot that through Christ it strengthens me. It was just that I can do the all things. And so then they started burning out. And when you start burning out, you start leaking venom all over the congregation and other people. And you don't preach a sound word when you are tired. Jesus took sabbaticals for a reason. They're in the text for a reason. So if the Son of God got to take a sabbatical to get away from the people, what's wrong with us? That we think we have to be there 24/7 and never say, I'm tired. If your people are so weak that you cannot set out a week, you have not been a leader, because you made them too dependent on you, as if you were God. That's called functional atheism, as if
Wow.
So it's okay. Call somebody else in, give them $5.25 and a sandwich, let them preach that Sunday. Now, the person you invite in to send a recording or whatever also has to understand that they're not there to take the church. They're there to be in confidence with you, to help you walk through some big seasons, because we have preachers dropping dead because they don't know how to say no. We have preachers even now that are so tired of recording without somebody in front of them that they didn't have content before the pandemic, and they don't have content now because they were too much into performance before the pandemic, and now they're searching for content. So those are some things that I would say. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Farr Brown. That brings us to our very last question, and is a question that we like to ask all of the preachers and scholars and theologians that visit with us. And that is and it is really an attempt to help expand the libraries of our chapel assistants as burgeoning scholars and preachers. If you were to recommend 3 books, what 3 books would you recommend? And of course, I'm going to throw a twist in there, because you have authored several books, Weary Throats and New Songs. Can a sister get a little help? Just thinking about all of your books. The twist is, what is one of your books that you would recommend?
I would recommend one of my books, Delivering the Sermon. very small book. But again, part of that is about care of the voice, care of your voice, breathing, understanding that God is not deaf, so you don't have to scream all the time to prove that you're high and holy. That it's how we articulate, it's how we use language, how we bring images together. So that's one of them. One of my good friends has written a book called How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon, Frank Thomas. And it's the first of 3 in a series. But I think it's critical to look at that. And he talks about the moral imagination, which is where I'm at. That are we people who will preach what God tells us about how we can move toward equity? Are we going to preach what's cute? What gets a rise out of people? Because we're supposed to be thinking people, but it's the imagination of how do I do this with some integrity to bring about this change we're talking about. So those 2 books. And let me think of one more. You would think because I teach preaching, I would have these in my head all the time. I think that Luke Powery and Sally Brown have a book called The Way of Words. And it kind of covers a variety of pieces in preaching. But I think that's a good book, particularly for chapel assistants to look at, about how we work through different parts of the sermon and how important how we speak and how we speak with each other, in fact, is. As we're speaking about a text, using our own hermeneutic. The last one, you asked me for 3, I'm going to give you one more. It's a festra for Tom Long. It's called Questions Preachers Ask. And there are 12 or 13 of us that wrote on different things. I have one called Preaching in an Era of Fragmentation and Fatigue that I built this off of. But I think that becomes critically important for us to also, there's some questions that come up all the time, and you could take one chapter in a small group and talk about what's in that chapter, whether it's the biblical text or what is look at prophetic or how where preaching is going the next few years. That I think is an essential book.
Thank you, Dr. Fry Brown. The time has been well spent, and we thank you for all of the wisdom and knowledge that you have imparted upon us. We know you have an extremely busy schedule, so we just want to thank you for always agreeing to come back to the chapel to share with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
On behalf of our founding dean, the Reverend Dr. Lawrence Edward Carter Sr., our associate campus minister, the Reverend Quincy James Reinhardt, and our president, Mr. Gabriel Denard Cloud, we want to welcome and invite you to join us on this Sunday, our Social Justice Sunday, in which we will have the Reverend Tracy Blackman, the executive minister of Justice and Witness for the United Church of Christ, serve as our guest preacher. It is certainly a sermon you do not want to miss. And we just ask that God's grace and peace continually reside with you during this time of fatigue and uncertainty. Thank you, and God bless.